The morning Diane Mercer walked out of Harlow Correctional Facility, she carried nothing but a manila envelope, a pair of worn-out sneakers, and 20 years of cold, calculated patience. The guards didn't say goodbye. The warden didn't shake her hand. Nobody came to pick her up. That was fine, she didn't need anybody. She stood at the edge of the parking lot, closed her eyes, and let the October wind hit her face. Then she pulled out a folded piece of paper from her bra, a list of 6 names written in pencil, so faded it was almost invisible. She didn't need to read it. She had memorized every single name the night they sent her away. "I gave you 20 years of my life," she whispered to no one. "Now I'm taking everything back." Part 1. The woman she used to be. Diane Mercer wasn't always the woman with the list. 20 years ago, she was a 34-year-old accountant living in the quiet suburb of Crestwood Falls. A place where people left their doors unlocked and neighbors brought casseroles. When your mother died, she had a daughter named Lily, 8 years old, with gap teeth and an obsession with sea turtles. She had a modest house on Elm Trace Road, with a garden she was slowly killing because she could never remember to water it. She had a brother, Marcus, who called every Sunday without fail. She had a life. A small, imperfect, deeply loved life. Her employer was Vantage Capital Group, a mid-sized investment firm run by a man named Gerald Holst, a well-dressed, well-connected pillar of the community. Gerald sat on the boards of 3 charities. He was photographed at every gala. He gave speeches about integrity. What nobody knew, what Diane discovered entirely by accident one Tuesday afternoon, was that Gerald Holst had been running a quiet but devastating fraud scheme for 9 years, siphoning retirement funds from hundreds of working-class clients, people who had trusted Vantage with their life savings. Diane found the discrepancies buried in a routine audit. At first, she thought it was a clerical error. Then she dug deeper. Then she realized what she was looking at, and her hands went cold. She made the worst decision of her life. She confronted Gerald directly. She thought he'd be ashamed. She thought naively, catastrophically, that he was a decent man who had made bad choices and would want a way out. She was wrong. Part 2. The setup. Within 2 weeks of that confrontation, Diane's entire world collapsed with the kind of speed that makes you realize the trap had already been built. You just hadn't stepped into it yet. It started with the tip. An anonymous call to the Financial Crimes Division claiming that a Vantage accountant had been embezzling client funds for years. Covering the trail using falsified audit reports, the accountant's name, Diane Mercer. The evidence was staggering. Bank accounts she'd never opened, transaction records with her digital signature, internal memos, convincing forgeries where Diane discussed how to keep the money moving. Gerald's own assistant, a woman named Patrice Cole, testified that she had personally witnessed Diane shredding documents. Diane's own lawyer, appointed by the court after her savings were frozen as part of the investigation, barely looked up from his notepad during the trial. 5 people sealed her fate. Gerald Holst, who sat in the witness stand looking heartbroken and betrayed, his voice catching as he described his shock at discovering what Diane had done. Patrice Cole, Gerald's loyal assistant, who lied with breathtaking composure. Raymond Silk, a forensic accountant who testified that the digital evidence pointed conclusively to Diane, when in fact he had been paid to reach that conclusion. Detective Aaron Price, who had rushed the investigation, ignored Diane's alibi witnesses and buried a key piece of exculpatory evidence. A server log that would have proven the account logins came from a different IP address entirely. Judge Wallace Creed, who had played golf with Gerald Holst for 15 years and saw no conflict of interest in presiding over the case. Diane was convicted of financial fraud, obstruction of justice, and theft, sentenced to 22 years. Her daughter Lily was taken in by Diane's sister in another state. Her brother Marcus spent his savings hiring an appeals attorney who got nowhere. And Gerald Holst. He restructured the firm, brought in new leadership, donated $200,000 to a victims advocacy fund, and received a commendation from the mayor's office for his cooperation with investigators. He became a hero. Diane became a number. Part 3. 20 years of preparation. Most people, destroyed so completely and unjustly, would either break or go numb. Diane did neither. In her second year at Harlow, she enrolled in every legal education program the prison offered. She studied case law, she read financial crime legislation, she wrote letters, thousands of them, to journalists, advocacy organizations, innocence projects, and regulatory bodies. Almost none of them were answered. She also made an unlikely friend, a former investigative journalist named Constance Beaumont, serving 5 years for contempt of court after refusing to reveal a source. Constance had spent 30 years exposing corruption. She saw something in Diane immediately. "You're not trying to survive this place," Constance told her once. "You're building something." "I'm learning," Diane replied. Same thing. Constance taught her how evidence chains worked, how to trace financial instruments, how journalists built cases that forced authorities to act when the authorities themselves were compromised. She connected Diane through letters smuggled out by a sympathetic guard with a network of investigative contacts on the outside. When Constance was released, she kept working on Diane's case quietly, patiently. And when Diane finally walked out of Harlow on that cold October morning, Constance was the one who had spent 3 years doing the groundwork. The trap wasn't set yet, but all the pieces were waiting. Part 4. The Reckoning. Diane didn't come home looking like a woman seeking revenge. She came home looking like a woman who had been through something terrible and simply wanted to rebuild. She rented a small apartment across town, under a name she had legally changed 6 months before her release. She got a job as a bookkeeper at a small landscaping company run by an old friend of Marcus's who asked no questions. She wore her hair differently. She lost weight in prison and never put it back. She was recognizable, but only if you were looking. Nobody was looking. Gerald Holst had long since moved on to a new firm, Pinnacle Wealth Partners, which had grown impressively in the past decade. He is 67 now, semi-retired, photographed at charity dinners. Patrice Cole had left the finance world, moved to a nearby county, remarried, and was running a small boutique. Raymond Silk had built a successful expert witness consulting business, testifying in financial crime cases, the extraordinary irony of which was not lost on Diane. Detective Aaron Price had retired and was now working private security for a real estate developer. Judge Wallace Creed was still on the bench. Diane and Constance's plan was not violence. It was never violence. Violence would have proved what they said about her. No, what Diane wanted was something far more surgical. She wanted the truth, and she wanted it in the light. Over the next 8 months, working through Constance's network and a young data forensics expert named Umlar, who owed Constance a favor from a decade-old story, they rebuilt the original fraud case from scratch. Umar located archived server data, backups that had been missed in the original investigation, that proved conclusively that the account activity attributed to Diane had originated from an IP address registered to a shell company controlled by Gerald Holst. Raymond Silk's original forensic report was sent anonymously to 3 university fraud researchers, who published a peer-reviewed analysis, finding 12 material errors, all of which happened to benefit the prosecution's narrative. Patrice Cole's ex-husband, bitter after a messy divorce, was located by Constance. He had always suspected what Patrice had done. With careful handling, he agreed to provide a sworn affidavit. Detective Aaron Price's personnel file, obtained through a public records request, revealed 2 prior complaints of evidence mishandling that had been buried. A civil liberties attorney Constance knew agreed to take Diane's case formally, using this as the foundation for a wrongful conviction appeal. And Gerald Holst. Diane had spent 18 months of her last years inside studying Pinnacle Wealth Partners. Old habits? It turned out, die hard. With Omar's help, they identified a pattern in Pinnacle's client reporting that bore striking resemblance to what Diane had first uncovered. Advantage Capital 20 years earlier. Gerald was doing it again. This time, the evidence went directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the State Attorney General's office, and 3 investigative journalists, including one at a national financial publication who had been looking for a Holst story for years and just needed a door opened. Part 5. The Fall. The story broke on a Wednesday morning. By noon, Pinnacle Wealth Partners had frozen trading of its funds. By evening, Gerald Holst had lawyered up. By Thursday, the SEC had announced a formal investigation. By Friday, his photograph was no longer associated with charity galas, it was associated with news crawlers. Diane watched it unfold from her small apartment, eating soup, saying nothing. The wrongful conviction appeal moved faster than her attorney had expected. The buried server logs, the peer-reviewed takedown of Silk's forensic report, Patrice Cole's ex-husband's affidavit, the civil rights attorney laid it out methodically, piece by piece. Raymond Silk's expert witness license was suspended pending review. Detective Price's prior misconduct files were reopened. Judge Creed, facing a judicial conduct inquiry, recused himself from the appeal and quietly announced his retirement 3 months later. Patrice Cole, faced with potential perjury charges, agreed to cooperate with investigators. Her statement confirmed what Diane had always known. Gerald had built the entire frame, provided the forged documents, and coached witnesses personally. 14 months after her release, Diane Mercer stood in a courtroom and heard 3 words she had waited 20 years for. Conviction hereby vacated. She didn't cry. She had already cried all those tears years ago, alone in a 6B8 cell on a Wednesday night when no one was watching. She simply nodded, thanked her attorney, and walked out into the afternoon. Epilogue. Gerald Holst was indicted on 11 federal counts. At 68, facing a potential sentence that would outlast his life expectancy, he pleaded guilty to avoid trial. He was sentenced to 14 years. Lily, now 28, a marine biologist living on the Gulf Coast, drove 16 hours to be at the appeal hearing. When Diane walked out of the courthouse, Lily was standing on the steps. They stood there for a long moment, looking at each other across 20 years of distance. And then they didn't have to say anything at all. Marcus called that night. He still called every Sunday. He had never once stopped. Diane went back to accounting. A small firm, honest clients, nothing glamorous. She also began consulting with an innocence advocacy organization, helping other wrongfully convicted people understand financial evidence trails. She kept the list. She never threw it away. But all 6 names had a single line drawn through them, not in anger, but in closure. She had done what she came to do, not by becoming something monstrous, but by becoming, despite everything they had done to her, something they never expected.